Hi, Miguel. Welcome to Venture with Grace.
Hey, Grace. Good to see you again.
Uh, I feel like I thought it would be a lot more efficient if we just turn it into a podcast episode instead of just catching up because I feel like I would definitely want to re-listen to our conversation. I feel like I sound so creepy right now, but okay. So you also, I feel like you started the podcasting journey maybe like a year before me or something because I definitely remember when I was doing research for my podcast, I was listening to your podcast episodes and Word 10 Fintech. It was like throwback a long time ago during the pandemic. But anyway, so let's fast forward to today. You have your own fund. You have your like Fintech Leader podcast. You have your Fintech Leader newsletter. And why don't we start with like I know you come from America, not come from America. You come to America during college, and why don't we start with like your college days to Wharton to starting this like media empire slash fund.
It's still a small empire, I would say, but it's a lot of fun.
Hey, a fun is a fun, so like don't undersell yourself.
So Grace, I started here in college, in community college, and that was a consequence of just not really knowing much about the system. My brother told me about community colleges, and it was the easiest way for me to get to the U.S. It was during a tough time. But as soon as I got here, my eyes opened up to the world of technology,
Mhm,
and I started trying out many different things. One random thing that we were doing back then, this is 16 years ago or more, it was trying to popularize QR codes in the US.
mhm,
Back then, no one, absolutely no one knew what a QR code was.
mhm,
And I went to South by Southwest. I think it was 2008, might have been 2009. I'm not sure. And I was part of like a small team of people, 10 to 20. And we were just trying to popularize QR codes that were popular in Japan and Korea
mhm,
back then, nowhere else in the world. It took a long time. Now I think everyone knows what a QR code is.
mhm,
But I realized there was no business model there for me, right? Like how do you make money off of that, unless you build a payments company, which I didn't do. I tried my hand with a media. My first media business was a
the
page.
Facebook comedy page.
Yeah, it was funny
Mhm.
videos. It got to 3 million subscribers almost in like
I
3 months.
always wonder who created these pages because
Yeah,
I've
you
seen
have it in
them.
front of you. Yeah, but I was too early because back then, Facebook. This is '08. Facebook did not allow for meme pages, right? And my one wasn't even a meme page the way you know them now. It was just posting funny videos,
Mhm,
and obviously people like those videos, but Zach himself did not,
mhm,
and I was shut down by himself, by Zach himself, plus not just me, but a few other people. Um, you got to remember, Facebook was a 4 or 5 year old company,
mhm,
different days. So I tasted tech entrepreneurship, but realized, I did not know anything, right?
mhm,
I much rather at that point realize that I had to surround myself with people who knew more about business, not just one or two, but many. And then
mhm,
I had to, um, get some business education, which college is not enough, right? So I moved to
mhm,
Washington, graduated from American University, and got into Citigroup. Uh, one of Citi has many rotational programs. This is the one that I joined was one of the most prestigious ones back then, and they promised you if you're a good performer, we'll rotate you around the company and around the world. And I
mhm,
got both of those, so I got to work out of Dublin, I got to work out of Latin America, mainly New York, though. That was always headquarters for me. And after 3 years there, I moved to Bank of Tokyo Mitsubishi. Right?
mhm,
I knew some people there. We worked together while I was at Citi, and then they liked how I worked, and asked me to move over. But I always had it in the back of my mind, like I got to do something more entrepreneurial. I started angel investing, tiny checks, but at least they got me in the door.
Mhm.
And then when I decided to leave banking, went to get my MBA to Wharton and the Lauder Institute, and just double down on fintech. And that's where I discovered the Wharton Fintech podcast. Right, I knew about it pre stepping into Wharton, but it just changed my life to realize that this was an asset that was there for the taking. Right,
Mhm.
it was managed by students, and students, MBA students, don't have any time. They're running around like chickens with their heads cut off. And so I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna focus, I'm gonna do nothing else, just this podcast for a while. Let's see what happens. And I did one episode and I was hooked. And my first episode, it was over the phone with a free phone call recording app, so the quality was trash.
You mean Skype?
No, it was worse, much worse than Skype. But I loved it. And I said, I'm going to do one a month. Then COVID hit,
Mhm.
and I found myself doing 6 a week instead of one a month. And that started to snowball. In parallel to that, the angel investing had gotten a little bit more serious. My co-founder, Andrew Endicott, and we started, doing more deals together. And then we started to do SPVs because people
Mhm.
wanted to invest along with us. And then we said we gotta professionalize this, and that became Gilgamesh Ventures, always with, right. And so now, fast forward a little bit, we've invested in almost 40 companies across the Americas.
Mhm.
We have, on the podcast side, I've recorded almost 300 episodes,
Mhm.
and it's just been an amazing ride. And I feel that we're super early, just getting started. If you're really committed to the venture world, you got to think in decades.
Mhm.
This is not a career that you try for 5 years. You really got to think, what's the minimum? It's like 15, 20 years, right? And so that's how I think about it, and trying to build something special.
I wonder, so I have a couple questions there. I feel like one of it was you transferred the Wharton FinTech brand to your own brand, Fintech Leaders. I guess like when you were building your own thing at that point, how many, I guess like how do you kind of like um did the transition, and what were things that you would do differently when you have your own thing? Because I feel like for Wharton, it's easier to get like amazing guests. Obviously, when you started, you already have a lot of guests that you already know, and but like I guess like how do you kind of build the brand for yourself? Also, like from like a tactical as a podcasting nerd, I wonder how do you kind of pivot out into like newsletter? I feel like a newsletter is like a piece that I'm like always so puzzled because I don't commit myself into reading a lot of newsletters. I'm like a big listening person.
Yeah.
I wonder how do you kind of like do a
Yeah.
newsletter that's like based off your podcast?
They're actually very related. The two parts of your question, they're for me, they're one and the same. Because when I was starting to podcast, I was doing, you're right, with the
Mhm.
Wharton FinTech podcast brand. And the Wharton brand
Also, I just want to give you some credit. Like not I give you some credit, but it's like I want to highlight your like credit that like before that I've never heard of Wharton FinTech has a podcast. And like so you
yeah,
kind of like making it took off. So like obviously like getting better guests is like amazing. By the way, we have some same guests. So like I mean you
love it.
have great guests. So like but besides that, like what were things that you did to kind of like even make a ancient podcast pop up?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so the podcast back at Wharton was managed differently. It was an episode a month, maybe two a month. Me and my co-host back then, Ryan Zauk,
Mhm,
we took a different approach, and we started to do several a week, 3 to 4 every week.
mhm,
So volume helps, right?
mhm,
You use the brand, and then you use that as a snowball effect. And after I would interview someone amazing, and they mentioned someone else in the interview, I
mhm,
was like, hey, can you introduce me to this other person? I'll interview them. And so it's a lot of hustle, the snowball effect. But like when I was like 5, 10 episodes in,
mhm,
I realized that I really liked this.
mhm,
And I told myself, okay, I got to find a way to graduate beyond the Wharton Fintech podcast.
Mhm.
And I started to talk to very successful podcasters who saw me producing content, and they were willing to talk. And the conclusion was very evident. It was like, you got to start building your own brand now, right? And so
Mhm.
I made a very conscious effort to build in my LinkedIn brand. Back then,
Mhm.
I was, like a normal person. I had 1,000, 2,000 connections.
Mhm.
But I realized the power of LinkedIn. And
Mhm.
so I started to build that. And then I started to build a newsletter because it was the only way that I thought to leverage the content that I was already producing in a
Mhm.
different vertical. So let me give you an example. I launched the newsletter the same day that I published my episode with David Velez, the founder of Nubank. You got to start big, right? And so
Mhm.
that was a great episode, and it was audio. But in parallel, I started the Fintech Leaders brand, where I wrote a summary of that episode. And all
Mhm.
of a sudden, people are like, oh, I don't have time for a 30-minute podcast, but I do want to read the 3-4 minute version. And
Mhm.
so the newsletter started to grow in parallel to the Wharton Fintech podcast, right? And so by the time I graduated, I think I had published close to 100 newsletter posts,
Mhm.
and they were just summaries of the episodes. And I think I had back then like 15,000 subscribers in the newsletter. Fast forward to today, across the newsletter and the podcast at Fintech Leaders, we've crossed 65,000.
Mhm.
And you know the majority of the audience, they're engaging through the written version, not the
Mhm.
audio, right? It's at the end of the day, it's a small number of people, and small is relative, like, but it's a small number of people who have the time to engage with a 30, 40, sometimes 50-minute episode. It's a much bigger pool of people who can read. And so I put a lot of effort into kind of distilling the top 4 to 6 lessons from that episode.
Mhm.
And for many people, that's enough. Others, they read it and then they want to hear more, and then they can listen to the full thing. So I don't add a lot of commentary about what I think about the company of my guest, about their opinions. I try to keep it very neutral, fun, but it's just a summary of what we've learned for this, and which means I gotta bring amazing guests, right? And
Mhm.
so that's always my focus. Keep up the high quality of people from whom we can learn. And if I'm honest with you, as a VC, I know that founders are far more interesting than VCs. And so my goal is to have at least 85% founders versus 15% VCs. Um, and there's still a lot of very interesting investors, but there's nothing like the founders. They're like Martinez Cavalli from GA says, they're the heroes of the journey. They're the protagonists.
I have like couple questions there. One is like um the intro side of things. I've always been like a I feel like my majority, like either like now since like the podcast is getting bigger, there's a lot of inbound, but like before the inbound era, I was like I definitely am like a cold call queen. I don't really like rely on like intro because I feel like the intro is like I asked you to introduce me to someone, and then this person like you have to say yes, and then that person have to say yes, and then the middle of the message have to be like not wrong. So there's a lot of things there, but however, I feel like I chat with like a many as you get like, chat with many like top podcast hosts, everyone's like, "Oh, you need to get like people intro you to people." Like I think when people intro you to people, people typically say, "Oh, here's like this random person that like I know that they crave like marketing exposure, than like, you know, a really intentional, like, you know, today, like let's say if I ask you, hey, introduce me to the CEO of New Bank or whatever, right? Like that's like a, I feel like, I wonder how do you navigate the relationship of like asking for an intro? Because I constantly feel like, oh, okay. So I ask you for intro, I kind of like take a burden on you. Like you have to back this person, and that person have to be like, yes, I will like of course you're offering value, but on the other way, it's like, okay, people may not see you're offering value.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the best intros, they are either past guests on your podcast
Mhm.
and who had a good experience, hopefully.
Oh yeah, of course.
Or board members or investors, right? And that's where the venture network can come into play. And also, if that investor is a listener of your
Mhm.
podcast,
Mhm.
they're gonna be incentivized, right? Because they
Mhm.
like it. So those tend to be really good. Or like someone who you know has a close relationship with the person you want to interview. Then there's obviously the cold inbounds. You know, you
Mhm.
got to do them, and sometimes the best interviews come out of that. Um, you and I are in a fortunate position that we now get inbound, and what's happened to me is sometimes is I reach out to someone or their head of communications or someone like that,
Mhm.
and then they tell me, wow, I was about to reach out to you, you know, perfect timing. That's been nice to see. But yeah, I'm very careful about asking for intros. I do it. I'm shameless, but I'm also very, very careful. I just sent a couple yesterday and I haven't heard back, you know, but so I might have to go direct.
Dude. Um, okay, so I got a question on the fund side. So you mentioned you started like doing angel and syndicate and then like eventually turn it into a fund. Also, I feel like the audience building, since you started at the Wharton era, like I think it's like easier to get like maybe let's say people from the Wharton community to like support, since you're
You would
a
think,
student, right?
but
No?
most of the guests were not.
No, I
Sometimes
mean
they
like
were.
listeners. What about listeners?
No, almost zero. Like the
What?
listeners, yeah, you would
Shouldn't
think
Wharton
also
people
this
listen to Wharton podcasts?
they should, but they're busy, right? So it was mostly fintech insiders, people who are interested in the industry, people who admire the business leaders being interviewed. So I think that was the fallacy of the kind of other people doing it. Like you think like, oh, I'm doing this for the students. Like wrong. You know,
Mhm,
you're doing it for the world, for whoever is
mhm.
interested in the world.
Interesting. I got another question on this. So one is like, I feel like when you started investing, let's talk about like pivoting onto investing. The among the angel checks, like what were the portfolio look like when you were starting raising money? Because I feel like, you know, we all do some angel investing tiny checks here or there, but it doesn't count as like a portfolio. And how do you kind of translate that into like a fund structure? Because
Yeah.
there's like portfolio construction, there's like deal sourcing, picking, like literally everything. How do you leverage your newsletter at all, like a newsletter slash like podcast at all, to like by the way, I need to take notes on like I need to start a newsletter like immediately. I feel I we have a newsletter, but like I don't really pay a lot of attention on it because I kind of like overcomplicate things. I'm like I don't even know why people would read newsletter, to be honest. Like I would only read if something that's like a very concrete like advice on like how to I don't know, like how to invest in XYZ, or like a very very detailed things. I've never read anything that's like a actual news. But that being said, I need to take notes. But anyway, so one of the things I wonder is um what you did really well is like, you know, you have this like really big platform. Like I wonder, do you use that for like investing purposes, or like, you know, maybe funneling deal flow from, you know, people on the show or something? Like how do you kind of like navigate that?
Yeah, all the time. And in fact, it's been a very important part of our identity, right?
Mhm,
So as we've talked, like I had a small angel portfolio, but it was very small. It was
Mhm,
maybe 5 companies, something like that.
mhm.
I mean, very targeted, but still small. But I think the important here,
Were they kind of like a Brex nowadays, or like were they like more of, is that like aligned with your current thesis, or was it like all over the place?
they were aligned. They were all
Okay.
fintech. Yeah, some known, some are not around anymore. Um, but so that was good. But you got to remember, I'm fortunate that I'm not a solo GP. Like
Yeah,
I
you have
think
two
it's,
founders, two
yeah,
co-founders.
yeah, yeah. So
Mhm,
I think it's very tough to be a solo GP. But I have a co-founder, Andrew Endicott, and then we have a third partner, Paula Yu. And so it's very hard to start something alone. And we're also very complementary.
mhm,
I have the banking background. I had the media brand and the reach, right,
mhm,
and just a good understanding of financial services. But Andrew, he is a co-founder of Pedal, right, and so
mhm,
that is something that's also very valuable. He has the founder empathy. He understands the founder journey, the good and the bad, right? And so that, I think, LPs appreciate that combination, right?
mhm.
And when it comes to the podcast, I mean, listen, the very first deal that we invested in out of Fund One, it was sourced through my LinkedIn DMs, inbound into me from a listener, right? So I always,
I feel like I have a lot of these inbounds, but I feel like everything I've invested, maybe most of the things I invested are all like I have to hunt them. I'm like, this is it. Like I have to, yeah, hunt
yeah, I
either
mean,
from
it's you still got
I
to do the work, right? But and I agree. It's still not easy, but the podcast gives us a high quality inbound pipeline, because I think most investors would agree the inbound that you get in your email, not the best. Sometimes
I
there,
think there is some best, but like the quantity versus quality
yes,
is very like hard to know. Like it's like, okay, after I read like I don't know 100 things that are like trying to sell it to me, I'm like, okay, so like I feel like I'm already like exhausting. Then like even if I get like a really quality deal, I'm like this deal pipeline is just like really random.
yeah,
But
it's very tough. It's very, but the inbound that I get from listeners,
mhm,
I tend to respect almost all of them, or
mhm.
all of them, right? And
Do you
it's
write back to all of them or like do you
it's tough to write back to
yeah.
everyone. Uh, I wish.
Especially when you're, like, telling people, "No, like, I'm sorry," but, like, I feel like I rather, like, I don't know, I feel like I have, like, rejection phobia. I hate rejecting people, so
It's tough to write back to everyone, but at least you got to have an idea of everything you're getting, right? And then you engage selectively. If you engage with everything, you wouldn't have time to do the actual work. But that's how, fast forward, I mentioned we've invested in, I think at this point it's 37 companies. Almost a third of those were sourced through a listener of the podcast, one way or another, be it a LinkedIn inbound DM, one of the live recordings that we organize. I've had many live recordings where
Mhm.
the audience in either New York, Sao Paulo, or anywhere else, the audience is full of fintech entrepreneurs.
Oh, you need to come to SF to do an SF. I would participate. I wanna be there,
I love
support.
it. All right, we'll plan it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I love it. And so that's very valuable. And why are people showing up? Because they see value, especially from the guests, right? And
Mhm,
so you can only do that if the content that you're producing is interesting to the founders, and then when you get on the phone with them, they're also testing how much you know about their industry, right? And we're
mhm,
specialists. We focus on fintech. Now, fintech is a big world,
mhm.
but we're highly specialized. And so the goal is always to get on the phone and earn the respect of the founders. They say, okay, this person understands what I'm building, right? And then I can see them kind of going with me through this journey.
I okay, so one of the topics that we were about to chat about is like related to this, which is like why specialization matters. As a podcaster, I feel like I'm constantly distracted by like how interesting different industries are, right? Like you have a really fintech focused podcast. Number one is like why you feel like basically how do you arrive at the position that you feel like fintech is like the thing I want to do for the rest of my life, and like how do you kind of like build expertise? I feel like with that, like when you are preparing your podcast episodes with the guests, like how much research do you go into it? Also, you come from the industry, I guess, like what did you know before, and like what were things that you feel like before going into a conversation you need to know? Like,
Yeah.
what's your research process, content diet look like to prep these?
Yeah. So let's talk about the podcast, but also about fintech specialization for the fun. On the podcast side, I think there's three dimensions of preparation, right? There's preparation about the industry,
Mhm,
about the guest, the subject, and
mhm,
about their company, right? And so for me, the one that takes the least amount of time is the first one because I'm
mhm.
covering the industry all day, every day, from the moment I wake up to the moment I go to sleep. And no exaggeration. That's all I do all day, every day. I'm talking to people in fintech. I'm reading. I'm listening to interviews. You name it. And so I typically know a lot of what's going on in the industry. You can never know enough, so you still got to do some research. Then on the, I guess
Oh,
on the,
by the way, what do you listen to? Like, what's your content that look like?
it's a lot of things,
Like,
but
you open The
I do love
Economist
in
and
terms
like,
of, yeah, in terms of podcasts, acquired
mhm,
and invest like the best from
mhm,
Patrick O'Shaughnessy. I've been a listener from the Tim Ferriss show from day one since his first episode, and I follow him for a long time.
mhm.
So sometimes I tune into his episodes, and then there's like 20 other podcasts that I sometimes tune in, but those are probably my top three, right?
What do you think are like good fintech related things, like fintech related newsletter, or like even like just like let's say The Economist or like something like classic that works too? Like I wonder how do you kind of like shape your fintech related thinking?
Yeah. So I want to get the names of the newsletters right because they're all kind of similar, and they're all my friends, so they're gonna give me shit if I get it wrong. No, but so FinTech Business Weekly by Jason Mikula
Oh,
is
everyone said that. Fintech Business Weekly.
so yeah.
So
So he's the
yeah,
modern day investigative reporter.
got
Then
it.
FinTech Brain Food, Simon Taylor, great analysis. Um, then there's F Prime, actually the fund, they have a
Mhm.
really good
Yeah, 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 the report. I have
yeah,
someone from F Prime on my show earlier when I started this thing, so they have a really good report. They just launched a report.
nice. Yeah, they do. It's
Yeah.
very good. And then Alex Johnson, FinTech Takes, of course. And then I think Nick Milanovich has done a great job building This Week in FinTech. And finally, not to be forgotten, Nicole Casperson. So she has built, a great media brand called FinTech is Fam, and she has captured a chunk of the audience that no one else was capturing, and that is, all the amazing women in FinTech, right? If you look at the subscriber numbers of pretty much every fintech newsletter and podcast, including mine, it's
Mhm,
gonna be somewhere between 70 to 90% male,
mhm,
subscribers. For Nicole's is the other way around, which is pretty impressive. And
mhm,
I know she's put on some great events.
mm. Okay, so I wonder, I'm definitely gonna check out all of these, and, so there who did the This Week in Fintech? I'm sorry, this is just like a
Yeah.
really
That's
popular name, so I wanted to make sure that I got the right one.
that's Nick Milanovic.
Okay, great. So I wonder, so when you are thinking about like, okay, so let's talk about the specialization. Um, I think it's really hard to narrow it down into like one subject area, especially as a podcast host. I feel like you're encountering every person from like different kind of um like amazing industry leaders in different places, like deep tech, SaaS, consumer. Although I love like there's like four sector that I really loved like deeper in, like, you know, deep tech, SaaS, gaming, and fintech. Those are like my things that I'm like really, I feel like for investment potential have like the biggest investment potential. But I feel like it's super hard to really just become like a specialized person in a specialized thing, because it's so very, very fascinating to me, many different sectors. I wonder for your case, like since you started your career in fintech or like in finance in general, how like what drives you to like really hammer down to selecting one industry that suits you?
Honestly, it's just like realizing that you like it. So I started in finance not as part of a grand plan. It was like a couple years before graduating. I realized I wanted to do that, but I was like, this looks interesting.
Mhm,
And then once I got into banking, I learned so much every year, and I was always engaged,
mhm,
and I kept getting promoted, and I was entertained. And once I left, I had a period where you're not quite in the MBA, but you're not working either. It was a short period, but I started to talk to a lot of people, leaders in the space, kind of like unrecorded, non-recorded podcasts, right?
mhm,
And the ones where I would actually get the most engaged and would light up, they would be leaders of banking, fintech companies, right? And so you just something about it just like drove me to
mhm,
the financial industry. I was, I like how it works. I like how interconnected it is around the world.
mhm,
There's so many challenges around it.
mhm,
It's also a huge industry, depending on where you're looking at. Like in the US, the financial sector is, I don't know, close to 10% of the GDP.
mhm,
And if you look at emerging markets, it's closer to a third. Right.
mhm,
So yes, we specialize in fintech, but it's a huge ecosystem, right? And so
mhm,
there are many sub verticals. So it's part of like pursuing what you like and doubling down and just focus. That's the name of the game for me. And so just focusing on fintech, and within fintech, trying to cover the verticals where you have strengths.
mhm,
And that translates
mhm,
into a lot of benefits for portfolio companies, right?
mhm,
You can be a lot more impactful, if you're specialized,
mhm,
because you know the space.
mhm. Um, in terms of like we chat about like, you know, you're getting some of really quality deals from the listeners. What about the guests? Like, do you get deal flow from the guests, and like how do you, for like the listeners, how do you quickly filter out like what's a good one? Because yeah, like I feel like that's probably for every VC, because you everybody get like a lot of deal flow in general, but yeah, how do you kind of like filter out the good one? Like what are some benchmark you're using in terms of like picking
For investing,
for investing, and for also like for podcasts, like basically how do you
yeah,
leverage your media platform to get like quality deal flow from
yeah,
guests and listeners?
yeah. I mean, sometimes you just gotta ask, right?
Mhm,
It's like, hey, you ask the people that you respect. It's like, hey, is there someone that's very smart that that's starting a fintech company or that might be starting one? And you'd be surprised how often people do know someone.
mhm,
And of course, 50 of those are not going to lead to anything, but one of those might.
mhm,
um, so for the podcast, it's much easier for me to source, because anyone who's built a massive company is going to have an interesting story.
Mhm.
Whether they're charismatic or not doesn't matter. They're gonna be passionate about it. They're gonna have something to tell. So for me, the filter is that, like, have you built an amazing company? Are you, do
Oh,
you
I
have the
mean,
time to talk to me?
I mean, like I guess like from like a deal flow
Yeah,
perspective, like let's say if I'm a fintech, if I'm like the founder of Stripe, like just using an exaggerated example, let's say I come on to Fintech Leaders podcast and um like how would you kind of navigate the conversation and like would it, I think like for founders they have incentive to share you with their deal flow, but like for investors, like would people actually share their like quality deal flow as they
yeah.
are also investors?
It's gotta be very organic, right? I hate to be salesy and pushy, and so if we get along, right, they're gonna
Mhm.
remember me. I'm hopefully kind of a reference that they think of when they looking at a early stage fintech deal. For investors, you're right, but there's different types of investors, right? If a growth investor sees an early stage company, they have all the incentive in the world
Yeah.
to share it because it's not for them. Um, and also it's about your own strategy. So we're a relatively small fund. Our checks are under $500,000, and so that means that we're extremely collaborative, right? And if a fund is leading or thinking of leading a seed round, and let's say the seed round is $3 to $4 million, they're going to take 40% of that. They're going to take maybe half. There's still going to be room for a few more funds. And
Mhm.
so if you're collaborative and your size is fits within that, they'll think of you. But also, I mean, you and I probably know hundreds of VCs. You can't be sharing deal flow with everyone all the time.
Mhm.
It's just not feasible. And so I think what most people do is same as like making friends. Like there are some investors that think like you, that kind of
Mhm.
like similar things, with whom you jive and you have good rapport, and you just naturally end up co-investing and sharing. And we have maybe 5 to 10 of those. We've probably co-invested with over 100, and they're all great. But there's just, the reality is that there's 5 to 10 with whom we end up crossing paths more often than not.
Mm. When you were coming up with your like fund strategy, why do you decide on like doing the non lead investor and like
Yeah.
how do you do like portfolio construction that I mean like obviously do not share anything that's sensitive. This is for educational and informational and basically this is for like entertainment purposes. Please just do not like come at us. Okay, please go. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm a huge believer that the way you build a fund is similar, or it's the same way you build a company,
Mm,
right? And you start small and you build a solid foundation, and then you use that foundation to build on top of that. And then so you start with the ground floor, then you
mhm,
build a second floor and 3 stories, 4 stories, and then all of a sudden you have a building. But we are early, and so we started with a very small fund,
mhm,
$10 million, right?
mhm,
But that shows to the market that you can do this job.
mhm,
It allows you to actually get your foot in the door in some great companies.
mhm,
And then once you're ready, you're like, all right, I'm seeing that in the last 5 deals that we've done, entrepreneurs are offering me bigger allocations. Maybe that's a sign, right?
mhm,
LPs are encouraging me, like maybe you can raise a larger fund, right? And so but you got to be smart. You can't overdo it. You can't jump from 10 to 100, right? You got to
mhm,
find like what's the next level that you feel comfortable that you can break in without running into adverse selection, because that will kill your company,
mhm,
right? And so now we're in fund two. Our
mhm.
checks are bigger. Like I
Congrats.
said, yeah, thank you. We're our checks are under 500,000, and so we'll be at this stage for a few years, and then we'll keep growing, right? But you have all this institutional knowledge, all this goodwill that you hopefully accumulate, and that allows you to graduate to the next step, right? And you as investor grow as well, right? So I'm a huge believer in just like building slowly,
Mhm.
surely, but slowly,
Mhm.
and just on top of a very strong foundation.
Um, I wonder how do you kind of like create a so we talk about like creating the deal flow pipeline, which is like, having tier one, like, fintech founders and investors onto the show and, attracting people who are like passionate about the industry, as well as like some networking within, the guests and hosts or listener ecosystem. Um, you mentioned like so and then like now comes to like the picking part. Are you like a thematic investor? Like do you have like here's like a three category of things where like really doubling down on maybe I don't know silver tech, which is like the older people using fintech app kind of like area, or let's say like femtech, like like how is like women use it, or like maybe like crypto or whatever. Like how do you come up with your own thesis, and what are things that for the listeners who are interested in fintech, like maybe they're starting a fintech company, who should reach out to you?
Yeah. So as much as you have to know what you like, you also have to know what you do not like, right?
Mhm.
So we have some areas that we just know that it's not for us
What
for
is it?
many
What is the no area?
for many reasons. I mean, you mentioned crypto. We're not a crypto. Oops, sorry about that. We're not a crypto fund, right? And it's mainly because to invest in crypto, I believe you have to cover it 24/7, right?
Mhm.
And that's a whole another industry. Not all of crypto is fintech. That's the thing
Mhm.
that is important to understand. If there is something at the intersection of fintech and crypto, or fintech and blockchain, we'll look at it, right? But if it's just like pure crypto, we want also consumer. We've invested in some consumer businesses, but it's 10% of what we
Mhm.
do. So we've been laser focused on mostly B2B, and within B2B, we absolutely have themes that we're always working on.
Mhm.
um, and if you look at our investments, they pretty much match those themes. That said, as long as it's within fintech, you
Mhm.
got to listen to the entrepreneurs, right?
Mhm.
Because there might be some areas that are up and coming and
Mhm.
you haven't even considered.
Mhm.
So it's also very important to listen to the entrepreneurs, the new ones that are starting
Mhm.
companies, and
Mhm.
also the ones that you've backed. Like, what are their problems that they're running into, right? what
Mhm.
are what are some of the observations that they're sharing, and sometimes that translates into a new thesis that then
Mhm.
drives an investment. So
Mhm. Oh, by
it's
the way, what is your thesis? Like you mentioned B2B SaaS, and then like obviously, among your 40 portfolios, I've seen a lot of better, but not like but like there's like yeah, I wonder what's your thesis? Like what would you focus on?
yeah, it's definitely companies that are transforming and advancing financial services
Mhm.
through technology, right? And
Mhm.
obviously that's very broad, but we try to focus on the tech of fintech, right? And so what we often find is what all of our companies are doing, they are greasing the wheels of commerce.
Mhm.
And so it's about that, right? It's about making the banking experience better.
Mhm.
It's about building better infrastructure. It's about improving the payments experience. It's about building software that kind of improves the efficiency of
Mhm.
CFO teams. So there are many use cases, but above everything is definitely driving the financial markets through through new technologies.
Mm. So when you say like um improving efficiency of CFO team, infra, like payment experiences. Um when you're picking these deals, like how do you diligence them? And also, since you mentioned like you're focusing on the tech of fintech, since like AI is very popular and like, I feel like the tech component changes a lot. I wonder, how do you, as a person coming from like a finance background, how do you kind of like do the diligence on the tech piece?
Yeah. I mean, listen, when you're investing pre-seed or
Mhm,
seed, the tech sometimes is not built, sometimes it is. And the beauty of being specialized is that in our network, be it LPs, be it friends of the fund, or advisors,
mhm,
we have a lot of people who are potential clients of these companies, right?
mhm,
So, I think everyone knows this, but the team is going to be driving, the biggest part of your decision. If it's an amazing
mhm,
team, the you start with that,
mhm,
but then it's about doing a lot of references, not just around the team, but also around the product, right? And like, who are they building for? Are they building for mid-sized banks in the US? We have a Rolodex of mid-sized banks in the US. Let's call them. Let's see, how big is this pain? Is it a real pain? Would they be interested in being a design partner, right?
mhm,
Or are they building for fintechs in Mexico?
mhm,
We can call a long list of, so it really depends, right? But if you are laser focused on the industry, you have that Rolodex, and you can make a smart decision. You mentioned the tech. You can rely on technical advisors, right?
mhm,
We have a number of CTOs or ex CTOs of large fintech companies
mhm,
in our network or as LPs,
mhm,
right? And we're not shy about giving them a call whenever necessary. But at the end of the day, if you're investing in a team and it's just a couple people or it's just a team of five, they are going to be building. You got to trust them, right? And
mhm,
but in order to trust them, you do all this diligence around it. And if you're covering the industry 24/7, at least you're going to have a sense on whether this is this is realistic or not, right?
mhm,
And we also, by the way, we are insiders, but we also like to invest in insiders. I think 90% of the founders that we have backed, they are fintech or financial services insiders, right?
mhm,
They had been doing it before they started this company. Like,
mhm,
we've invested in some founders that were superstars in their past companies, and they were employees, they were not founders, and they started to hear a complaint or an idea from clients, not just one client, but two, three, four, sometimes 50. And these people, they could not go to sleep because they would only
mhm,
think about, like, hey, every one of my clients, they're asking me
mhm,
for this
mhm,
one thing. I gotta go build it.
mhm,
And you'd be surprised how, like, just in our portfolio, we have quite a few founders with that exact same story, right?
mhm,
So definitely also backing insiders is super important.
mm. Um, I love that. So basically, you're like pre-selecting people based on their past experience. Um, so like, is you mentioned 90% of founders have been like, the superstar of like their past company in like a fintech, either a startup or like big company, assuming. Um, when I wanna, since like we have like maybe around 10 minutes left, and I don't know if you have a hard stop at 10.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so let's just quickly go through, like, I have like one big bracket of question, which is like, building relationship with LPs. Obviously, you have some amazing guests who I don't know if they're your LPs, or like, how do you kind of like approach fundraising? And again, this podcast is for like entertainment and just like learning purposes. So like, this is not fundraising advice or founding advice or investing advice. This is just like us sharing, experience as like just like operators or like observers and everything.
Yeah, happy to say that about 30 of my guests are also LPs in the fund, but that was very, very organic. It was never part of my strategy. It didn't happen until like guest number 50, I think, or maybe more,
Mhm.
until someone asked me, "Is like, hey, can I also participate?" And I was like, "Of course you can." And then that story repeated itself
Mhm.
30 times, and so that's been great. But I think fundraising as an emerging manager is one of the toughest things that you can do in VC, because you're going against very proven brands
Mhm.
that can raise much more easily. That's
Mhm.
the reality. So the more you do it, you realize you gotta find new pockets of capital that aren't necessarily kind of already saturated with the rest of the industry.
Mhm.
And so it's about building a lot of relationships,
Mhm.
giving access to people that haven't had it before to the
Mhm.
industry, right? That's also something important.
Mhm.
A good chunk of our investors, I don't know the percentage, but I know they had little to no exposure in VC, right?
Mhm.
Um, and it's a very, very long term game, right?
Mhm.
Serious LPs, they like to take sometimes years
Mhm.
before they commit, and I
Mhm.
understand it, right? Like, time is a great way to diligence
Mhm.
a team, right? And so if you are not willing to put in the time, it's going to be very hard to go past a small fund,
Mhm.
right? If you really want to graduate to the big leagues and start getting institutional capital, family offices, you gotta pound the pavement, you gotta meet a lot of people, and then build genuine relationships. There's no way around it, right?
Mhm.
And then show them that you're actually doing what you said you were gonna do years ago, right? And then you're sticking to your strategy, right? But this is a never-ending topic for every GP that you talk.
Mhm. Uh, so do you as for like, you know, the I guess like when like, we talk about like, deal sourcing, picking, um like basically also winning. So I feel like the podcast and newsletter will give you an edge to like win deal in general. Um I don't know if you have to compete with like a big name or something and then you win. Any story in that line that like, how do you kind of like quickly tell people your unfair advantage when they may not be like super familiar with you in the first place at the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, it's still a hustle, right? And
Mhm.
we all have occasions where you were left out, right?
Mhm.
And sometimes years down the line you were glad you were left out. Other
Mhm.
times it hurts. But I think the strategy as a small fund, again, is to be very collaborative and to avoid competing
Mhm.
with big brands, right?
Mhm.
At least when you're starting out, because most of the time an emerging manager is going to lose against
Mhm.
the number. I'm not going to list them, but there's too many to list, right?
Mhm.
And so going back to the strategy of being collaborative, speed is your advantage. If you're amongst the first ones to have conviction in the team while
Mhm.
also doing your diligence, but also doing it quickly, that can be a good way to win. And then beyond speed, it's just earning the respect of the founders is tremendously important.
Mhm.
Once we've invested, we always tell founders, hey, whoever you want to work with for future rounds, like make sure that you guys get along, right? That you
Mhm.
respect them and you get along. So that also helps, right? It's I think it's very, very important. Um, and then just showing that, we love to be an open book about like, hey, these are our founders. You want to talk to anyone, they'll tell you what it really is like working with us. Don't take our word for it, right? And that happens less than you'd imagine. Founders ask for, not often do you hear founders asking for references. Maybe they're doing in the back, and that'll be fine. But yeah, it's a combination of things. The specialization is key, though, right? Because then you can become, sort of an extension of their team. I mean, I don't want to imply that VCs will do the job for founders, not even close. But for savvy founders, if they're astute, they can put VCs to work, right? Or not just VCs, angels. And that means they can get client introductions, they can get new hire introductions, they can get investor introductions, reporters introductions, bankers, capital providers. So the list goes on and on. So you can be an extension of the capital markets team. You can be an extension of the head of people. You can be an extension of the CEO, and this is very selective engagements, but you can only do that as a founder and as a VC if there's information being shared, right? And so I think the best founders that we see, not just in our portfolio, but in the industry, they're very good about putting their cap table to work for them.
Okay, amazing. We have a 1-minute fire round. I'll wrap up very fast. What's your favorite book?
Too many to list, but
oh my God, we have so many listeners. Hi, Leonard. Hi, Armando. Hi, Mark. Anyway, so let's go for what's your favorite book?
My favorite book, I don't know. I like the biography of Rockefeller. That one was really good.
Who made the biggest impact in your career?
Family, for sure.
Who would you invite to your dinner party?
Who would I invite to my dinner party? Bill Gates. I think it would be fascinating to
oh
learn.
My God. Invite me, by the way. Where can we find you outside of work?
Around the streets of Manhattan. I love New York City.
Amazing. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Miguel, for coming on the show today. I'm sorry we went over a little bit.
No, all good. Thank you, Grace.
Okay, let me quickly